Welcome to Believe in Jaguars. I'm your host, Bucky Brooks, and I'm really excited about the guest that I have today, Demetrius Harvey, who covers all things Jaguars for the Florida Times Union. Demetrius,
Everything's going great.
glad to
I
have you
appreciate
on.
you
How's everything?
you having me on.
And look, man, so the Jaguars were coming off a disappointing 2023. Like it's a season in which we had high expectations, big plans. I mean, look, I'll be the first one to think that I thought we were going to be a title contender. It didn't go the way that we expected. We had, look, a colossal collapse at the end of the season to finish 9-8. And there have been a ton of changes for the Jaguars since. Like, let's just talk about like the offseason, some of the changes that we've seen, particularly in the coaching staff, and some of the things that stand out to you when you see
Mhm.
old staff out, new staff in. What are the things that kind of
Yeah,
resonate
I
with
mean,
you about
I,
this
I
new coaching
think
staff?
in large part, it seems like, obviously that collapse sort of just made it almost impossible for the Jaguars to retain all their coaching staff. So a change was needed in some fashion. The defensive collapse obviously made it possible that the defense was probably going to be the one that sort of took that blow. To bring in Ryan Nielsen and just looking at his background and where he comes from, coming from New Orleans and obviously in Atlanta last year, you could really see how attacking his defenses are. How it seems like say on within the secondary, your corners are pushed up, your corners are battling at the line of scrimmage. Your defensive line is getting penetration. It's a 4-3 front. I think it really bodes well for what the Jaguars have to offer. I know Tyson Campbell might have struggled a little bit his first year when he was tasked to play man to man a little bit, but guess what? He's a guy that's very physical. He does tackle. He's a willing tackler. He's very aggressive. I feel like he fits to a T. And then you look at the defensive line. You have Josh Allen, you have Trayvon Walker. Trayvon's another guy coming out of Georgia. I know you've talked about him plenty of times, and he wasn't necessarily a player that was just an edge rusher. He lined up everywhere. It wasn't necessarily something that he was asked to do in what he did in 2022 when he was drafted in 2023 last year. Now with Ryan Nielsen here, perhaps he's going to be playing more down. They're going to be playing more four-man fronts. He can sort of get into that natural progression and maybe even slide inside. I just think all of the aggressiveness and the versatility and what we've heard, because we haven't seen any of this, and what we've heard about Ryan Nielsen and his staff, bringing in a guy like
Mhm.
Chris Richard, who's had plenty of success. Obviously with the Seattle Seahawks, he was an incredible influence to the Legion of Boom there down in I think it was 2013 through 2016, something like that. And so yeah, I really do think
Yeah.
it's a positive outlook. You have guys now, and it's nothing disparaging against the last defensive staff, but these guys are more experienced. The last defensive staff, Mike Caldwell was in his first year as a defensive coordinator after, obviously he was coaching for a while as a inside linebackers coach, but it wasn't necessarily something that he's done in his time in the NFL. Now you have Ryan Nielsen. I know he only has 1 year, but just in terms of the quality of coaches, it just feels like there's more agreement and more alignment, perhaps, and so I just think that it only bodes well for the Jags.
It's funny because there is something to be said for that. It's not only like the experience, but I think the experience really
Right.
matters when it comes to the way that you teach. And I think it's really important that you have teachers that match the personnel that needs to be taught. And so, do you have guys that are extremely detailed? Do you have guys that are demanding when it comes to, hey, this is what we want, this is how we want it, and we're not going to relent off those standards? I thought it was very interesting in his introductory presser where he talked about from a defensive
Mhm.
standpoint, nothing cheap, nothing deep. We're going to press up on the outside, take away the gimmies, but not allow the deep ball. We're going to run to the ball. We're going to do these little things that you would hear a high school coach talk about. But when you looked at the Jaguars last year, you felt like, hey, man, some of those high
Mhm.
school things, so those fundamental things, those were the things that were costing the team. And so I'm excited about that part. I think the funny thing is when we kind of talked to Jaguars people, there was a lot of maybe consternation about Press Taylor staying over and why is Doug Peterson handing him the call sheet and this and that. What was your take on the offense last year, Press Taylor's first year as a play caller, like the
Mhm.
overall? picture of the
Yeah, no, it
offense
was
last year
definitely
that was a bit of a
disappointing. It was
disappointment.
you were entering a season where Trevor Lawrence was expected to post big numbers. He only had, I think, 24 touchdowns, 12 interceptions. The offense in general wasn't scoring as much as Doug Peterson wanted. He staunchly wanted them to have about 30 points per game, and it wasn't hyperbole because that's just the direction that the NFL is going. That's the direction
Mhm.
the Jaguars offense was supposed to be going. To me, when you look at how the offense played last year, I I can't just blame it on play calling because you have a situation, especially on the offensive line,
Mhm.
that was just in flux almost every week. Every week we were asking, who do you think is going to start at left tackle? Who do you think is going to start at left guard?
Mhm.
What's going on with the center position? All of those kind of things. Brandon Sheriff, is he healthy? There was so much to do with that key aspect of any offense in the NFL, let alone the Jaguars offense. It's an offense that didn't have necessarily that huge play, wide receiver. I know Calvin Ridley was there, but he's coming off of 2 years out of the league.
Mhm.
Christian Kirk, he's a guy that
Yeah.
is great, but he's a slot player. He's not going to necessarily demand the outside attention, which is what you need to be able to get outside, even on runs. It's so it was just a mess of a situation where I think they were constrained on what they could do. They couldn't run the ball. They had to go more horizontal in order to do that, do more
Mhm.
screens, things like that. And so it was just a culmination of a lot of things going wrong. Now, does that mean that Press Taylor deserves no blame at all? Of course. Even he admits that there are some things that he could have done better.
Mhm.
There's some play calls he could have done better. And I do think there is something to the aspect of Doug Peterson was a Super Bowl winning head coach calling plays. I'm sure Shad Khan brought him in and thought he was going to be calling the plays.
Mhm.
Obviously, Shad's going to say whatever you think is best is good to go. But I do think there is something a little bit to the fact that maybe Doug should be calling the plays since that's sort of how he got his name and everything. Mhm.
Yeah, no, look, it's hard to say someone who has won a Super Bowl as a play
Right.
caller should hand the call sheet off. Normally, in those situations, when you have someone like that, you have someone who's the offensive coordinator in name, and he actually may call the plays, but the head coach will insert himself into the game and call a
Mhm.
handful of plays or take it over or do those moments. Because Doug Peterson has learned, obviously, from Andy Reid, that's what Andy Reid does. We see there are times where you can tell
Yes.
when Andy Reid is heavily in the game as the play caller. And a lot of times that's in either big
Mhm.
games or down when it gets to the playoffs. Andy Reid appears to be more of the guy that is more assertive when it comes to that. And I think we still have to remember for Doug, he's still kind of learning how to navigate this situation in Jacksonville. It was year two. He's entering year three. He should be more comfortable as a head coach. And when you're more comfortable as a head coach, now you can kind of
Mhm.
figure out which responsibilities you want to take on, which you want to pass off. I do think it's important, as much as all of the attention will be on the
Yeah.
defense. This is an offensive driven team. This team was expected to reach higher heights because of the offense. Trevor Lawrence, the weapons that they have on the outside, and now this offensive line. Look, it kind of leads me to the thing. What do you think about
Mhm.
all of the offseason movement, like free agency first? Because the big conversation in Jacksonville, obviously, you were there. People were wondering, what are they going to do
Mhm.
with Calvin Ridley? Is Calvin Ridley going to be here? Does he deserve to get paid? Is the price tag too big? Yada, yada, yada. And then I felt like this. I felt like maybe there was a lack of appreciation for Calvin. Then he goes to Tennessee, and it's the immediate panic. So, how do you feel about the Jaguars' approach to free agency and what they
Yeah, I'll just
settled
speak
with
on
before
the
they attacked the
on the
draft?
Calvin thing real quick. It is interesting. I thought, obviously last season he had his ups and downs, and it seemed like the fan base was like, nope, you got to get rid of this guy. He's not doing anything that we thought he was going to do. And then the minute he's about to leave, it's like, no, don't do that, don't do that. But but that's kind of normal. I mean, obviously the Jags really wanted to bring back Calvin. They thought that was going to happen, at least from what I was told. And so when he did go to Tennessee, it was a little bit of a shocker, but they had the game plan in mind. They already had signed Gabe Davis. They were going to bring back Calvin with Gabe Davis. And just to talk about some of the free agent signings they did have, I think that Gabe is a guy that can bring that downfield threat. And he's not necessarily a blazer. I think he ran like a 4.5 40, but the guy can get open downfield. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. And so, I think that that's something that they desperately needed. And it's something that Zay Jones honestly, could have provided. And he did provide a little bit of that in 2022. But due to injuries and all of that kind of stuff, that's probably why he's now cast away. But Gabe Davis is young. He's a guy that's going to be able to come in and I think really attack that perimeter of the offense, which is primarily when you look at Doug Peterson's offenses, in Philly, and you look at a guy like Alshon Jeffrey and who he had in 2017. He's a guy to me, I think, kind of compares a little bit to Gabe. He's not maybe as big, or Gabe's not maybe as big as Alshon was, but he's a guy that can get downfield, make those contested catches. I think that's an important part of the offense, and so that was a good move, I thought. And then we talked about the offensive line earlier. They did do a move. They got Mitch Morris in here. For now, we all kind of assume he's going to be the starter. They haven't necessarily said that, but that makes sense. It's a move to sort of get that veteran piece in there at center, and perhaps solidify and calcify the offensive line. And I think that that's going to pay dividends to Trevor Lawrence. That's going to pay dividends to Ezra Cleveland on his left, and then obviously Brandon Sheriff on his right. And it also might pay dividends to Luke Fortner. He's a guy that's still young in this league. He's only entering his third year. This is a guy that can maybe learn from Mitch Morris and perhaps retain that starting role maybe next year. You just never know. So, all of the offensive moves that the Jaguars made in free agency, I thought were positive. I thought that was something that they needed to do to head into the right direction. Bringing back Ezra Cleveland, retaining Brandon Sheriff with the restructured contract, and then it seems like Cam Robinson's still going to be there. So it's an offensive line that they've said in the past they just want their starting five to actually play, and this is perhaps the first opportunity.
Yeah, I think it's so interesting. I think I was of the mindset that Cam Robinson was not going to be there just because of the salary cap restraints and those things. But then what we saw was a huge salary cap jump, which allowed the Jaguars to keep Cam Robinson in there. And you bring up a really good point, and I think people miss out on that. The front five didn't really play together much at all last season. Cam Robinson had the 4-game suspension. Then you had a myriad of injuries and kind of musical chairs along the front line. So you never had the continuity that you needed up front. And anyone who knows offensive line play, look, man, the five have to operate as one. And the only way for them to do that is they have to be able to finish each other's sentences through constant repetition and being together and those things. And so if there is a reason for optimism, is that if this offensive line is back, they should be much better than what they were a year ago. And I would say, of anything, right now, if you talk about Mitch Moore stepping in at center, and then Ezra Cleveland and Cam Robinson on the left, you have Sheriff and Antoine Harrison on the right. The weak link going into the year would appear to be Sheriff just because he's a declining player in the twilight of his career. But if that's the only weak link, his experience and savvy should be good enough for them to be able to get by. So knock on wood, if they stay healthy, they should be fine up front. And then what you said on the outside, because I think it's interesting when we talk about their offense and Gabe Davis and his importance. Gabe Davis gives the Jaguars something that they didn't have, a vertical stretch player. And so I felt like there were times that the Jaguars were stuck at the YMCA playing half-court basketball, right? They couldn't stretch the field. They couldn't get people from prevent them from clamping on Christian Kirk and Evan Ingram. Well, Gabe Davis throughout his career has averaged over 16 yards a catch. He has 27 touchdowns. He's had big games where when you read the scouting report, you at least have to pay attention to him on the vertical part of the field. And we'll talk about Brian Thomas Jr. coming over, but he's another guy like that is a vertical stretch guy. So all of a sudden now you force defenses to back up, which allows your two best pass catchers, and I'll say this, Christian Kirk and Evan Ingram, to do all the stuff that they did in 2022 when they worked the horizontal part of the field, crossing routes and those things. And so I feel like offensively, they're better constructed to play the way that they want to play, with receivers on the outside that can push and create the threat of the deep ball, which opens up the field not only for the guys that we talked about, but now Travis Etienne, Tank Bixby, they also should have more room to run. Even though this will never be a run-first offense, it just needs to be run enough to keep everybody balanced. let's talk about defense because you kind of touched on it, like Trayvon Walker, Josh Allen signing his deal, coming back. Um, but in
Mhm.
free agency, they went and got Eric Armstead, and they added some more veterans in the back end. You talk about Ron Darby, Darnell Savage. What do you think about the veterans that
Yeah, I
came
thought that
over to
the
really
Eric
help this
Armstead signing
defense?
was a coup. I mean, that was something that the defensive line needs. It's a person who can penetrate defensively as a pass rusher, but also just hold up. I mean, a lot of times last year you saw people maybe out of their gaps a little bit, doing too much or whatever the case may be. They weren't getting enough push up front. And that was with guys like Roy Robertson Harris on the team, Trayvon Walker, Josh Allen. And so to be able to get that interior pressure up, and we already saw it. I'm sure we'll talk about it a little bit, but Mason Smith, them drafting him in the second round was another signal to the fact that they want more interior pressure. Moving
Mm-hmm.
toward this 4-3 defense, obviously, it's going to require more bodies in there to sort of rotate in. And so I thought that was an impressive addition. And then you kind of look at the secondary and the Darius Williams, perhaps he just didn't fit the scheme, but they moved on. And so you bring in Ronald Darby, who Doug Peterson obviously is very familiar with. Ryan Nielsen probably check marked and signed off on it because that's a guy that can come in and play man to man, or just play press. It doesn't necessarily have to be man to man, but go in there and be physical outside at corner.
Mm-hmm.
The Darnell Savage one is actually probably the most intriguing to me because during his career with Green Bay, he didn't really
Mm-hmm.
play nickel too much. So I mean, I'm curious to see how he fits because I went back and looked at his tape at Maryland, and the guy can run. I mean, he's fast, he's physical, he's athletic.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like it does
Yeah.
translate to that sort of big slot sort of nickel player. It just kind of translates well, and so to actually realize it and see it will be really interesting to me. But yeah, bringing in a few of those kind of guys, I think that makes all the difference because last year I felt like the depth just wasn't necessarily there. They struggled outside at times, with injuries. Tyson Campbell got hurt. Monteric Brown had to go in, so bolstering that secondary made sense. They had to replace Jenkins, they had to replace Williams too. So it just for what they did, I understand it completely.
No, so I look really excited. So like whenever you think about building the team, like you approach it a couple different ways. You have free agency where you can really take care of a lot of needs, and then if you do that, it allows you in the draft to take best player available. So we talked about the veterans that came in. Eric Armstead being a huge addition, Ronald Darby and Darnell Savage obviously being additions. And I'll say this with Darnell Savage: as much as we liked Antonio Johnson playing in the nickel, what Darnell Savage does is he gives the defense more flexibility. You can change your matchups each week. We're
Mm-hmm.
seeing more of these defenses do these exotic hybrid type sub packages. Well, now you have more weapons. And then when you think about the young guy, Jerry Jones, coming over from Florida State, who's a natural nickel player, you think about the other young players that they brought on the outside. To me, what they've done is in the defensive backfield, they've tried to assemble enough athletes that they can figure out how we need to play with what we have. And I don't think that we've always had that in Jacksonville the last couple of years, being able to kind of dictate to the offense, no, this is how you're going to have to play based on how we want to play, as opposed to, hey, we only have these limited options. We have to play a certain way. I think that changes. But overall, tell me your thought on the draft because there's been a lot of conversation about BTJ. Some people love it, some people hate it. What was your initial reaction when they decided to
Yeah,
go
I
with
mean,
the
my
wide
initial
receiver at 17?
reaction, I wasn't necessarily surprised, but I was a little bit. Terrion Arnold was still there. I kind of had that pegged, and maybe that was my fault for just kind of locking in on
Mm-hmm.
one guy. Quinyon Mitchell went the pick before I believe after they traded down. So, but once they got Brian, to me it always made sense. I understand what they're trying to do. To replace Calvin Ridley, they were going to draft a a receiver at some point, either if it was the first round or the second round or the third round. This draft was deep with wide receiver talent, so passing on one just wouldn't have made sense. But you bring in a guy like Brian Thomas, who to me was the fourth best wide receiver in this class. I mean, and I think that was sort of the consensus. Or at least I thought it was until I saw the reactions. And so, to me, he's a guy that can come in and he doesn't have to be the guy right away. You talked about it with the Gabe Davis signing, how it's going to open up things for Evan Ingram and Christian Kirk. you don't necessarily need a Brian Thomas to have that happen. And so now that they have that player, they can start to implement some more things downfield. They don't have to necessarily have him come in and run all these different kind of routes. You know, he can kind of pretty much play the same number of routes. I think it was only a few at LSU in his first year. You know, obviously they're going to probably try to mix him in a little bit more than that. But to me, it felt like a pick that is for the future. It's a pick that's for Trevor Lawrence and sort of establishing what they
Mm-hmm.
want out of that position group moving forward, because Christian Kirk's going to be up in the next couple of years. So you go out, you sign Gabe Davis, you draft
Mm-hmm.
Brian Thomas. To me, it just makes sense. He's a field stretcher. I think he averaged like 23 yards per catch, something crazy, and then 17 touchdowns. I mean, you just can't
Yeah.
pass up on that kind of production at LSU, in my opinion.
No, he's a
Mm-hmm.
fantastic player, fantastic prospect, and I think the next gen stats when they tracked him at combine, his speed on go routes was the fastest of any
Mm-hmm.
any prospect that worked out at the combine. So that's significance in terms of the speed that you now have put on the outside with him and Gabe Davis, how they can stretch the field and create opportunities. But you kind of led me into something that I naturally had to ask you about. We talked about in the future and how this wide receiver core could look, and you mentioned Trevor Lawrence. Trevor Lawrence had his fifth-year option picked up. Trevor Lawrence is eligible to kind of start talking about contracts and contract extensions and these things. So let's talk about that. One,
Mm-hmm.
you've been in Jacksonville for a long time. Haven't had many quarterbacks that have donned the uniform.
Mm-hmm.
Do the Jaguars pay Trevor Lawrence? And should they, if they do pay him, should they pay whatever they need to keep him, or should they
I
take a
think they
wait and
should
see
pay him and pay
approach?
him whatever he needs. To me, I've seen enough. I don't know about you, but you know, I've seen the guy play and how incredible it looks. It's not like any other quarterback the Jaguars have ever had, in my opinion. Maybe Mark Brunell, depending on what you want to say there. But you know, it seems like this is a guy who's a
Mm-hmm.
franchise quarterback, not just on the field but off the field as well. He's a star and top class person. He's a perfect
Mm-hmm.
leader. He says all the right things. He does all the right things in the locker room. Players love him. I know Zay Jones was just released, but he loved Trevor Lawrence. Like
Mm-hmm.
they were best friends. Him and Christian Kirk immediately bonded as well. Him and Evan Ingram are bonded. This seems like a perfect
Yeah.
situation for Jacksonville. There's nothing to me to show why you wouldn't pay Trevor Lawrence. You've seen all these NFL teams. They'll pay the guy if they think that he even might be. Daniel Jones got paid, for example. Not to besmirch him, but you know it's
Yeah.
probably a lesser standard than to Trevor Lawrence's abilities, just in terms of his potential, all those
Mm-hmm.
kind of things. So to me, I've seen enough. I think the Jaguars have seen enough too, and I do think that that's a situation that'll probably be resolved if not right before the season, maybe training camp. I just have that feeling.
No, it's funny. So here's the debate that everyone has when it comes to the quarterback, because it's not only about paying the quarterback, but it's being
Yeah,
comfortable with the sticker shock that's going to come with it. So Jaguars fans sit down and I tell them, hey, this is going to fall in between maybe 53 to 55 million annually for your franchise quarterback.
right.
Look, that's the cost of doing business. And the other issue that you have, the price never goes down. It only goes up. And so we're talking about Trevor Lawrence potentially getting $300 million on maybe a 6-year deal at a minimum, at 50 million per, going
Mm-hmm.
up to maybe 55 annually. That is what it needs. Because if you
Yep.
wait, now you're going to talk about 60 million annually. And the important part that everyone has to understand, some of the moves that were made when it comes to drafting the wide receiver, Brian Thomas Jr., some of the other guys that are coming in, you have to kind of start clearing the decks monetarily to take on that big contract that Trevor's going to command. And as Trevor gets paid, the players on the outside have to get younger and cheaper, because you're not going to be able to pay everybody top dollar. And when you factor in Josh Allen getting his big extension, this team now has to be one that really crushes it in the draft, because when you start to get your young marquee players moving into their second contracts, it's really, really critical that you draft well and that it works out. So give me one thing before you go, because you were down. Jarvis Landry came through for the tryout. We haven't heard anything about it. You got any news on Jarvis Landry? Do you think he's going to be a Jaguar? Or was that just kicking the
They're just
tires
going
on
to
a
kick the
veteran player
tires
who's
with it,
played at
and
a high
and
level?
and I'm not sure exactly if they're going to sign him. We'll see on Friday when they get on the field and they do all their things. I'm not sure. But to me, it does signal something where they're giving him an opportunity, and then also giving themselves an opportunity to look at a veteran player. You know, he's not going to be playing special teams, but if you can get a reliable guy that can sort of come in, say Christian Kirk does get hurt, you know, he can come in and sort of fill that role reliably. I think it makes sense to go ahead and sign him. He said in an interview he's not necessarily looking for money. I know that that's like a big meme kind of thing, but you know, it's a situation where I think if it makes sense for the Jaguars, it's going to make sense for Jarvis. So you know, I could definitely see them signing him.
Hey, look, man, I think if they pull it off, I actually think it's the right kind of move for them. I think he gives them a couple things. I think from a theme of the offseason, we have seen the Jaguars bring in veterans who are experienced, professional, with leadership skills, and very competitive. When you're trying to change the dynamic in the locker room, you want to add more pieces to that. By all accounts, Jarvis Landry is super competitive, has natural leadership ability. To me, he'd be a nice addition as a guy that's maybe your fourth receiver that could play a bigger role down the stretch. Look, if it doesn't cost a lot, I think it's
Absolutely.
one that we probably could see get done. But Demetrius, look, man, this was great, man. It was great having you on. I want to make sure that I shout you out. Where
Yeah,
can the
they can
people
just
follow
follow me
you?
on
Where can they reach
Twitter
your
or
site?
X at Demetrius82, and then obviously at Jacksonville.com with the Florida Times Union. We have plenty of content coming out all the time. So just go on Jacksonville.com, click on Jaguars, and there you go.
Nah, that's great, man. Thanks so much for coming on. Like it, I've looked forward to it.
Mhm.
It's been a long time
Absolutely.
coming, so maybe we can do this again. So, guys, that's it. Jags Nation. If you're enjoying the show, make sure to follow us, rate, and review on your favorite podcast platform. Spread the word to your friends too. Don't forget to follow Believe Network on all social channels and leave questions on Believe's YouTube. Your feedback makes our community stronger. You can also watch and listen to other Believe shows on Believe Football Channel on Fubo, streaming on YouTube. Maybe your friend is a Cowboys fan. Tell them about Believe in Jaguars. I was on it last time. So that's it. Thanks, Duval. We'll see you next time on Believe in Jaguars.